Hello there, welcome back. I'm really excited to show you something different today. I made a quilt! For those of you who don't know, I am not a quilter. In fact, I've only been sewing garments for the past 3 years. Sewing was the skill that I taught myself during the pandemic. That I already had a sewing machine and some very, very basic knowledge, and I really wanted to make my own clothes, so that's what I learned during the pandemic. Now for quilting, I feel like that is a whole other art form. I already felt that before I got into it, and I've been just admiring it from the distance for a long time. I just thinking that it was too hard maybe for myself. I don't know. I am not a person who's very good with like cutting things exactly in a straight line, and in school when you have to build those 3D cubes and pyramids with paper, I just could not do it. I mean, cutting fabric, cutting patterns is the hardest part for me when I'm sewing. So why did I suddenly just got over my fear of quilting and got into it? Many reasons. I think I've been more exposed to quilting just for the past year, maybe looking at it online. But also earlier this year, I was invited by a friend to go check out the Brooklyn Quilters Guild show, which was I think in April, and that was so inspiring. I had a great time looking at all the quilts, and it was the thing that got me thinking, I really want to try this. This is really cool. And why not? I really thought that having the basis of knowing how to use a sewing machine, how to having already the tools and some of the knowledge would help make it a little easier. And I think it did help, but it was quite an adventure. It is a completely different monster, and it's there are things that I already knew or that helped me get through it, but it still took me a long time, and I think I learned a lot. So today I just want to show you my quilting journey and how I made my first quilt. If you are also interested in starting quilting and like me have thought about it for a while but not quite got into it, maybe this video will inspire you. And if you're already a quilter and you'll see all the mistakes I made, feel free to point them out. I'm learning. I am all for learning this new skill, and I have a lot of respect for those of you who have been doing it for a long time. I, of course, was doing all of this on my own. I am very self-taught. Every sewing, knitting, crocheting skill that I've learned has been me, myself, doing it on my own and researching, finding blogs and videos and tutorials and all that kind of stuff just to get myself into it and practicing. So to start this quilt, I thought I should find a pattern that actually gives me the instructions and shows me the step-by-step, and ideally also videos, which is what I did. So first I had to find a pattern that was simple enough for a beginner, but still, a challenge and interesting. I didn't want to get too into doing like crazy shapes or, I don't know, something that would have been fun but too challenging, because I know you have to walk before you run. Every single time I learn a new skill, I always want to go to the hardest thing, but I have learned that you have to start with something simple, which is what I did. It still was a lot of work though. So the pattern I decided to go with is called Charming One Quilt by Sharon Holland. It happens to be a free pattern, which even better. That way, if I ended up abandoning the project, which thankfully I didn't, but if I did, I wasn't investing too much into it. And she has a lot of great free patterns in her website. I wanted something big enough that I could use as a throw blanket or on my bed. I think that would probably made it harder if I had stuck to something smaller, like a baby blanket, or even smaller, like just like a quilt for the wall. Maybe that would have been easier. So that was kind of my first mistake as a beginner. I'm glad that I did it anyway, because I figured it out and it worked out in the end. So maybe the fact that this was a simpler pattern, because the way that it's built, it's mostly just, or it is just squares in a diamond shape diagonally. So it was more about choosing the colors and putting it together rather than thinking too much about the shapes or whatever. So I thought it would be easier, and it was, but the size of it just made it such a bigger project that it definitely added a level that I did not think it would. Once I had my pattern selected and ready to go, I had to get some fabric, and my fabric stash isn't that big, and most of it is like the specific fabric that I use for the specific projects that I had, and not a lot of quilting cotton. I don't just buy fabric. I don't have a lot of space, so I don't keep a lot of fabric in hand. So I thought the best would be to just buy a fat quarter bundle. I did want to cut the squares myself because I didn't want it pre-cut. But I did not want to think too much about the combination of color. I mean, I knew I had to design, how it's gonna be in the quilt, but I like the bundles because they already are pre-selected, and the colors go so well together. It was kind of like a rainbow bundle because it had a lot of colors and then a lot of patterns in it, kind of fall-ish. But the store I bought it from is called Binded with Love on Etsy, and they were wonderful. The fabric was super fast, and I actually had it sitting there, and I just kind of like had to build myself the courage to start cutting it, and it finally did. I also had to do a little trip to Michael's where I bought some extra materials. I had to get new blades for my rotary cutter. And I think I also got some other stuff. I don't know, probably pens and a bunch of stuff, because I definitely realized the more I went into it that I did not have every single thing I thought I needed. But eventually I got into cutting, and that was fairly easy, especially once I had the quilting ruler and I got into a rhythm. And because they were all fat quarters, I found like tutorial that told you how to, I think they were like 5-inch squares or something like that. I don't remember, but it was pretty simple. I got into a rhythm. It took a while, and that was my first clue of like, maybe this is bigger of a project than I thought it was gonna be. But I got through it. It was pretty easy. And then the next step, once I had them cut, was to figure out the arrangement. Like I said, this quilt is quite simple. The squares are just placed diagonally, so it was more about thinking about how I was gonna go about the colors. I intentionally did not get solid colors, which again, probably should have. I did use the dark blue cotton that I already had in my stash for the edges as a solid color, but I didn't have any solid color inside the quilt. I don't think it looks bad in the end. It might have helped with thinking about the design. But I don't know. I just liked the entire bundle so much. I wanted to use every single fabric that I had, and I did end up. I had some left, but I did end up using at least a couple squares of every single fabric that I had. And so what I wanted to do, it was lay it on the floor so I could figure out the design. The pattern itself and the instructions that I found online, or the tutorials that I found online, kept saying to do it on a wall, but I don't have a wall big enough where I could hang something and then put the squares. And I realized quite quickly why they suggested that way. When it was on the floor, it just involved a lot of squatting and a lot of crawling on the ground, and it took me a whole day, I think, to figure out how I wanted it to look. I changed it maybe 3 times, the whole thing. I just was very indecisive, I guess, and it just didn't quite look the way I wanted it to. While I was doing it, I had a thought, and I probably should have done it. I thought maybe this would have been so much easier if I had just scanned the fabric and then done this on Photoshop, figure out how I want it to look, and then just quickly follow that configuration. But I guess it was too late by then. I was too invested in being on the floor, and it was almost done. So I didn't do that, but next time maybe I will. But anyway, I did eventually figure out how I wanted it to look, and I was very pleased with myself. So the next step was finally getting into sewing. That was kind of the exciting part for me, to actually get into sewing and quilting. So sewing them together wasn't super hard or anything. Again, it felt kind of like cutting, where it's like the repetitive action and then you see it grow as you go, and it's kind of rewarding and mindless, I would say, because it's so repetitive and the same thing. I didn't always have every single square line up, and I don't know if it's because I cut it wrong, probably because I cut it wrong, or because I sewed something wrong, but it wasn't so glaringly obvious that I didn't feel like undoing it and trying again. So I just kept going, and in the end it worked out. It ended up the right size, so phew, on my first try. It still took a long time because, again, how big the quilt is. I think it took me like 3 weekends of a few hours each weekend of working on it. And finally, when it was together, I got to the parts that were all new to me, which was quilting, basically. I cut the backing and the batting, and that was also a whole thing. not the cutting, but once you sandwich all three of them together before quilting, I did not know how to do that. I tried it on the floor again. That did not work because it was kind of all scrunched up. The backing was all scrunched up under all layers, and I had to look for some tutorials, which if you want to find all the tutorials that I used to get myself into quilting, I will copy them below. All of these wonderful people, very good explanations. They saved me. I could not have finished this quilt without all their help. So I finally watched a video on how to, because I don't have like a big enough surface that could help me lay it in a way that it wouldn't be crunched up under the top of the quilt. So I found a tutorial which allows you to kind of fold it as you go. I don't even remember how I did it, but I did it, and I pinned it together, and I was ready to quilt. I chose to do the stitch in the ditch stitch. Say that 3 times. Anyway, I chose to do that because that's what the pattern recommended, and because it seemed like the easier option. I quickly learned that it's not precisely easy, but probably easier than starting with with if I had to make lines on the quilt and follow them. I probably would not have been really good at that. So I said I'm just gonna follow. For those of you who don't know, stitch in the ditch, you basically are just following the quilt on top of the ridges of the stitches that you already made for the squares, if that makes sense. So that's what I did, and like I said, it wasn't hard in itself. It just took a long time. I think another probably 2 or 3 weekends of my life to get through the entire quilt. Once I got into the rhythm again, it felt like a repetitive thing where, like, at the beginning of each one of the stages I had trouble, but once I got into the rhythm, it just felt not as hard, and I got into it. And I did it. I quilted the entire thing. It was really satisfying. It took so long because every time I kept being like, okay, I think that was the last one, and I turned it around and realized that no, I still have some patches that were not quilted. So it did take a while, but once it was finally done, the last step was binding, and I learned a lot about binding because I know how to do bias binding and to make bias tape, but I didn't know how to do it with the quilt, and it wasn't super hard. It's basically the same idea. It wasn't bias tape. It was different because the tape is not made in the bias. So I had to find yet another video that would explain how to do it and how to bind it in a way that you couldn't tell where the binding began and where it ended. So I did that. I found a video. I will link it too. And that didn't take us long, actually. I thought it was going to, but it didn't take us, I don't know, maybe by that point I was just so into it that I was like, I'm going to finish this no matter what. So I made binding out of the same dark blue fabric that the edges of the quilt had, and the backing I just chose like a pink color, and like looking back I wish I had chosen a different, like a darker color, or maybe like an orange that goes with the quilt, or a rust color, because a lot of the quilt I feel like that has that fall rust and white colors in it, but the pink works fine. It's just the backing, it doesn't really matter, I think. And yeah, so binding by hand invisibly was the last step of my quilt, and then it just felt, I feel these every time I finish a project, where it just suddenly you're done, and you look around and you're like, oh, that was it is done, now what? They kind of get that, like, now what? That's probably what makes us all keep just grabbing another project and finishing and having several projects at the same time, because finishing a huge project is such a weird feeling, at least to me. I don't know, maybe because it was the excitement of being done with my first quilt. I kind of couldn't believe it, but I did finish, and I'm gonna show you what it looks. I am so excited to show you. So that is my quilt. Oh my gosh, I still can't believe I finished it. Another thing that was funny about this project is that I did this during the whole summer, and I thought, oh well, I'm sewing, it won't be as warm as if I'm knitting. This is my big project of the summer. And then I realized, well, there's so much fabric everywhere, and it is warm in the end because it's a blanket, that I was hot a lot of the time. But I got through it. I finished my blanket. I finished my, I forget how big it is, but it is smaller than my queen size bed, but I feel like if I had a twin size bed, it probably would be big enough for it. I'm so happy with it. I have so much respect for people who quilts all the time. I think I will keep on it. It is definitely, the thrill of it is really fun. And now I have my eye on all the other different patterns that are out there, and I want to learn new techniques and everything. Still, it's a lot of work. Probably won't make more than one quilt a year. I don't think I'll get into it soon again, but I definitely will. It is definitely very different from making a garment. The stages are similar, of course. You cut, you sew, but there's just a different something about it that is different for me, the way you're thinking about it. No, I wouldn't say that it's more creative, because obviously if you are sewing patterns from scratch and designing them, that's a lot of work. I never have done that. I just already work from existing patterns. But it did feel more involved for me, because I had to choose not just the fabric for the garment, like the one fabric or maybe two, but so many different combinations and how to, first I had to choose all the different fabrics, and then how they were going to go together, and the backing was another thing, and then the binding was another thing. So I felt like there were a lot of creative choices and a lot of creative freedom in it, and I can see why it's almost like painting, I would say, where like you add on and it looks different and it has a lot of choices. I mean, not like painting, but I don't know. I'm just rambling now. It doesn't make sense, but it was a different experience, and I really enjoyed it. And like I said, I have a lot of respect for quilters, and I want to learn more. I'm even thinking of getting a new machine, because the one I have is a very basic one that I got years ago just to learn to sew, and I'm already like hungry for more. So I figured out how to make with the tools and the knowledge that I had. I kind of think they would have been easier if I had someone holding my hand, but I am very grateful for all the people out there on YouTube and that are making tutorials and videos telling people how to do this stuff, because it really, really helps. What's next? Like I said, I definitely want to make more. Maybe in the meantime, I want to try making other objects that use the quilting techniques, but that are not like a big quilt. Maybe like a bag, or like a little pouch, or something else that is quilted but it's not like a huge quilt, so that I can also use my scraps. I'm thinking I can't wait to make another quilt. I would love to get your thoughts on my first quilt. Any tips you have for me after watching me struggle through that whole process. For any of you out there who also would like to try quilting but never have, please don't go ahead, try it. I hope this video gave you some encourage to give it a go. Like I said, I will link to all the videos that were helpful for me. Hopefully they're helpful for you too. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching and coming in this quilting adventure with me. If you have any suggestions also of other quilts I should make, please go ahead and leave them below, because I like I said, I am so excited to try another. So yeah, happy making!